Amo Yisrael, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We take some time now to read the second paragraph of the Shema to ourselves, joining back together on the top of page 70. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת להם, ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם, ונתנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת, והיה להם לציצית, וריתם אותו, וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני, ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם, אשר אתם זונים אחריהם, למען תזכרו, ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Emet. All this is true and firmly held by us, that you are our living God and no other exists, and that we are Israel, your people. You perform great deeds beyond research, too wonderful to tell. Your children saw your power, praised and thanked your name, and willingly accepted your rule over them. With great joy, Moses and Miriam and the children of Israel answered you in song, all of them saying,
Mi chamocha
Bailim Adonai, mi chamocha neda b'kodesh,
Nora
tehilot, oseh, elef, noga, tehilot, oseh, Adonai Eloheinu,
Ahuv Hayam, Yachad Kulam Hodu, Behimrichu Amaru.
Adonai
Adonai
Lo
Yimlo
Leolam
Leolam Vaed.
Adonai
Adonai Yimlo Leolam Vaed.
ונאמר, כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני, גאל ישראל.
Source of our life and our sovereign, cause us to lie down in peace and rise again to enjoy life. Spread over us the covering of your peace. Guide us with your good counsel and save us for the sake of your name. Be a shield about us, turning away every enemy, disease, violence, hunger, and sorrow. Remove the temptation that awaits us and the guilt that lies behind us. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, for you are a God who guards and protects us, a ruler of mercy and compassion. Guard us when we go out and when we come in, to enjoy life and peace, both now and forever. Blessed are you, God, guarding your people Israel forever. Baruch atah Adonai, shomer amo Yisrael, la'ad. Baruch Adonai bayom, Baruch Adonai balayla, Baruch Adonai b'shochbeinu, Baruch Adonai b'kumeinu. Ki v'yadacha nafshot hachayim v'hametim, asher b'yado nefesh kol chai v'ruach kol basar ish. B'yadacha afkid ruchi, padito ti Adonai elemet. Eloheinu shebashamayim, yached shimcha, v'kayem malchutcha tamid, Umeloch aleinu leolam vaed.
Please rise as we turn to page 74.
Adonai sfatai tiftach ufi yadi tilatecha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avoteinu v'Elohei imotenu.
Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov,
Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah. Ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanora, El Elyon gomel chasadim tovim, konei hakol v'zocher chasdei avot v'imahot, ומביא גואל לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם, פוקד שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע. מוריד הטל, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים. נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו, לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומדומה לה, מלך ממית ומחיה ומציח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לך חיות מתים. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים. אתה קדוש ושמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהללוך הסלע, ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. And we continue with our own prayer through to page 86. break from the Amidah to do the counting of the Omer, which you will find on page 308. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat ha'omer. Blessed are you, our living God, sovereign of the universe, whose commandments make us holy and who commands us to count the Omer. We are entering the 12th day of the Omer. We say, Hayom Shem Esrei Yom Shehem Echad Shavuot U'Shnei Yamim LaOmer. This is the 12th day of the Omer, which makes 1 week and 2 days of the Omer. It's
1 week and 5 days.
1 week and 5 days, that's right. What did I say? I said 2 days, yes. Right, I'll say that again. Hayom Shtei Esrei Yom Shehem Echad Shavuot V'Chamesh Yamim LaOmer. Thank you. And we are on page 86. 2 days come from right.
Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al
I invite everyone to take your seats as we prepare to transition into our moment of testimony. And as we prepare to hear this important account, we meditate on the words that you'll find in your special supplements for this evening, the words of Eli, Eli, a melody that has accompanied us so much in memory and in meaning throughout history and throughout our Jewish journeys. We're on our shul sheets.
Shall
strange but rather lovely things that came out of our Darkness into Light project was that we became friends with people that we didn't know before in the community. And one of the people that became my friend, and is still my friend, is the wonderful Nellie Davis. Nellie and I started by just having phone calls as everybody else did. We found what we had in common together. Nellie's late husband had been a GP that I knew of in Edgware when I was training as a GP in Edgware. And we started with the more trivial subjects in life. When things in COVID got a little bit better, I went to walk with her in the sort of countryside near where she lives in Arkley. And gradually, she started to talk to me about the deeper and more interesting part of her life, and about her life as a child, as an older child, during the war, and the very difficult and very moving story of her life. And as I heard this story, I already clicked in my brain that this is a story that needs to be heard more widely than just by me. And so I spoke to Lynette and said, I think this lady should tell us all on Yom HaShoah about her story. And so it's my great honor and privilege that she's here on Zoom and she's going to share her story with all of us here, both in the synagogue and in the wider community tonight. And so I invite Nellie to now tell that same story to all of us here this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, Shalom. Can you hear me? I'll start with where.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Lovely. I'll start with where I came from. I was born in Vienna in September 1931, which makes me nearly 91. But I still have very vivid memories, visual memories of my childhood there and after. Our apartment was in the Oberaugartenstrasse, which was on the fringes of the Leopoldstadt, of which you may have heard, which was a Jewish area of Vienna. Opposite us was a beautiful park called the Augarten. Nearby was the Stephanskirche. Vienna was a very beautiful city. Many of the buildings looked like iced wedding cakes. It was quite spectacular. We lived in a very nice apartment there, and perhaps my parents' background would be relevant here. They both came from Poland, but from areas which are now Ukraine. My father came from a little village called Poticek in the Ravaruska area. They came from a poorish family and had to work very hard. They had particularly terrible times during the 1418 war, where there was hunger and extreme poverty and very tough times. And I remember some of his tales of that time, how at one point his parents bought him a pair of trousers for his birthday, which he was very delighted with. And he and his friends went swimming in the river nearby. And when he came out, his trousers had been stolen. He was terribly upset, and the other boys and their families clubbed together to replace them. I also remember hearing that in 1914, when there had been terrible battles in Ravaruska and when there was hunger, he queued for about 2 hours at 6:30 in the morning for potatoes, which was their main food at the time. He was one of 5 siblings. There were 4 brothers and a sister. And as they got older, they went in different directions. 3 of the brothers went to Chemnitz, which at the time was Germany, and started up with some cousins a stocking factory there, which did quite well. My father and another brother stayed in Ravaruska area, where there was a thriving fur trade, and he learned to be a furrier. At the age of 18, he left Ravaruska and went to Vienna, where he continued in the fur trade and built up a business of his own. And at the age of 31, he married my mother, who 31, 21. He married my mother, who was about 20 at the time, and she worked with him in his shop. And they bought this lovely flat, which I said we lived in. We had a maid called Mitzi who would collect me from my little infant school, a Jewish Montessori school that I went to and which was very happy in, and would take me to the park and to the Prater. Well, we went all together to the Prater, which is a famous fairground in Vienna, which I think almost everyone has heard of, where my favorite things were the great big Riesenrad, roundabout, Ferris wheel, where there was a great big wooden figure of a Chinaman in the center called Kalifati, and where there was a little Lilliputian village of small people. And all these things are still very vivid in my mind. My mother came from Lvov. She came from a very well-to-do family. We have, oddly enough, traced photographs of her parents' gravestones in Lvov, yes?
Chernovitz.
In Chernovitz, that's right, in Chernovitz. And they are great, massive, expensive stones with their stories on them. And
Chernobyl smashed now.
all of which has been smashed since then. She married Neumann Sitter, who had previously courted her, but when she refused him, he married someone else by whom he had 3 children. And when his marriage broke up, he came back to her and said, "You refused me in the past. Will you have pity on me now with my 3 children?" And she did indeed marry him and waited 2 years to have children of her own so that they shouldn't feel displaced. He was a very, very well qualified water engineer and became famous for a project which he worked on with George Steiner called Venedig in Wien, Venice in Vienna, and built huge waterways and canals. It started as an exhibition and lasted for 30 years, and people could go in gondolas along these waterways. His brother Karl went into he got 2 medals for his Venice and Vienna thing. His brother Karl became an officer in the Austrian army and fought in the 1418 war and also in the Franco-Prussian War, and also received medals, and then went into the Kriegsministerium, the Ministry of War, where he served for many years. So they had both obviously done well, which did them no good at all in later years. Where am I now, Jude?
Now, what happened to you as a little girl in Vienna? What do you remember? Why did you have to leave?
I remember in 1938, I remember things changed, and I remember one Shabbat evening with a candle lit before us. And the reason I remember it is not that I understood what was happening, but because of the intensity of emotion that I felt at the time. My parents were concentrated on listening to the radio, and shortly after, my uncle ran from Rotterdam to say, you leave Vienna at once and come and stay with us. I only learned this later, of course. That evening was the 11th of March 1938, the eve of the Anschluss.
What happened in the following early weeks?
A few days later, Mitzi and I went out for a walk, and the streets were thronged and crowded with people, and a huge procession was passing, all shouting, "Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil," and no doubt I joined in with the rest of them, being only 6, and it was all very exciting. In the following weeks, my father was dragged out and harassed a couple of times, and my mother became very anxious about what was going on, and they tried to find ways of leaving, and finally she said to him, "The only way any of us will get out here is if you go to London and try and get me out from there, and I'll try from this end. I'll stay with the baby." The baby was my little sister who had been born in 1937 and was about 9 months at this time.
How come your dad was able to go to London? What did he have?
My father was able to go to London because, being in the fur trade, he used to go regularly to London to the Hudson Bay auctions where you traded furs and skins. So he took me and went. I had no papers of any sort. I was on my mother's passport, not my father's. He took me and went to Holland, leaving my poor mother and my little sister to cope, because that was the only choice they had. I remember, the first thing I remember in Holland is arriving at my uncle's family's house and seeing my little cousin Bronya, who was about 2 years older than me, jumping up with excitement on a settee. She had been made a bed in the living room because she had earache, but she was so excited to see her cousin arrive. There was also her older brother, Mundi, who was a lovely young fellow and about 13 at the time. And I stayed with them. My father stayed a week or so and went on to London. I stayed with them for about 3 months illegally and unable to go out. Missing my family, but happy with my cousins and my kind family in Rotterdam. After about 3 months, a colleague of my father's from London came to fetch me. The only papers he had were a letter from a little boarding school saying they were expecting me in a few weeks' time. I don't even remember the journey to London, but I do remember being delighted to see my father. And I remember some weeks later, he took me to some English friends who, on my birthday in September, bought me a big doll with beautiful gowns on, and I was very happy with this. When I went to the little boarding school, it was very difficult at first because nobody at all spoke German, and I spoke no English. The matron who was there was very kind and friendly and gave me sweets and was friendly to my father, who did speak some English. And I stayed there. He would visit me almost every Sunday and take me out to tea. And in the meantime, I went to primary school there during the day and learned English amazingly quickly under the circumstances.
Can I ask you, I remember you said about your father, he was trying to send money and he didn't have any food in that time?
My father had great difficulties financially at the time. He was trying to work, newly setting himself up in London. He was paying fees for me. He was visiting me from London at the weekend and taking me out to tea, and probably also trying to help my mother. How he managed, I don't know, but I know that he economized on eating and said that he would buy dry bread so that he shouldn't have too much of an appetite. So things were not easy for him. My mother, meanwhile, had a very tough time in Vienna. Mitzi, the lovely maid we'd had, had a Gestapo boyfriend. My mother was a very attractive woman, and the boyfriend started to harass her and be knocking at the door at all hours. And she would pretend she was in. She wasn't in. And when it all got too worrying and he had bothered her once too many times, she went and lived with some relatives in another part of Vienna with some cousins.
And what was she doing during that time? Presumably your dad managed to get a visa for her?
My father tried to get a visa. He went and visited some relatives in Birmingham and asked if they would sponsor him. And they said they were charming to him, liked him very much, but said they couldn't take the responsibility. Needless to say, none of us ever saw them again. My mother, meanwhile, was queuing with a baby in her arms day in, day out, trying to get a visa herself for wherever she could. And finally, she was called, and there were two officers in the
Gestapo.
Two Gestapo officers in the room when she went in, who were not all friendly and pretty tough. And one of them left the room, and the other said, "Look, let me help you. Here's a visa." And as the other one came in, he said, "Get out, go on, get out," so that she went out quickly and there were no problems with the other one. He had told her to get a train as quickly as she possibly could, and she certainly did. She had put some personal jewelry in a ball of wool, of knitting wool, which she used on the journey. And
what happened at the station?
At the station, the train was very crowded. People were climbing on rapidly. She showed her visa and her passport, and the officer who saw the J on her passport for Jewish realized that she would have little chance of getting on the train. So he made way and pushed her onto the train, put some money in her hand and said, "We're not all the same," which was a very encouraging thought.
And was
that was in August 1939.
And war broke out?
War broke out within September. In September 39, beginning of September 1939. So she just made in time. When she arrived, my father brought her to see me at the little boarding school, and I was just struck with amazement. I stood there looking at her. I knew who she was. I knew the baby there. My father was standing a step behind her, and I couldn't utter a word. I can remember to this moment what she was wearing and how it all looked. She was wearing a pale green suit, beautiful suit, which she made herself. And I remember thinking, I wonder if she's brought my teddy bear for me. It was very strange, and obviously I was delighted to see her, but it took a few moments before I could even understand that this was real and what was happening.
Can I ask you about a few little experiences that you had in London in the war, because you lived in Stoke Newington at that point?
My father found a flat for us in Stoke Newington, at which time he brought me back home to join the family. And we used to go down to our Anderson shelter in the garden, which he'd made comfortable for us with cupboards where we could store blankets and food. And my little sister and I were taken down there at 5 every afternoon before the air raid started, and my parents would join us shortly after. And I remember very, very clearly and very visually, one night there was a direct hit on the building next door to us, which was a little convent school, luckily empty at night. And as they were hit, the gas pipes caught fire and the blast blew the door away from our Anderson shelter, and all we could see were flames. It was a terrifying, terrifying experience, and I remember crying for hours.
And so you went You changed, you went to the
After that, we
Holborn.
used to go to Holborn Underground as a shelter. Holborn was the deepest of the undergrounds, and people would take their blankets and sandwiches and sleep on the platform, and the trains would run until 1 in the morning. But the atmosphere was friendly.
Briefly, you were evacuated ultimately to Wales.
We had a few evacuations, but the last of them was to Llanelli in South Wales, where we were taken to a little village called Felinford and stood in a big hall while people pointed to us and said, "I'll have that one." And first one we went to was not very nice. My sister and I had measles. It was a bitterly cold winter, and the neighbors next door said, "Wrap the children up in blankets and bring them straight here." The daughter of the house there was a dressmaker. My mother had trained as a couturier, and they were great friends and got on very well. And their parents were grandparents to my sister and me. We loved them, and they were wonderful to us. He was a miner, a coal miner, and had leucosis from his work. She was a lovely old lady who had a big sack of flour and would make all the bread and make parsnip wine, made us feel very at home.
And may I ask you, obviously you survived the war and you came back to London, and then after the war, your father started to try and find out from the Red Cross what happened.
My father
to your
came back to
cousins and
London.
everything.
He bought a very nice house for us in London, having been working in Llanelli for some years as in a fur shop there. And in
Carry on.
we came back to London. I'm stuck.
That's all right. Father tried from the Red Cross to find out what happened to his brothers and sisters.
That's why I'm stuck.
And your mother's brothers and sisters.
I'm sorry, I'm stuck because it's very distressing from then on. He tried, it took about a year after the war to find what had happened to his family.
What happened to your family, your cousins that you stayed with in Rotterdam?
The first most terrible was my lovely family in Rotterdam. My aunt, my uncle, my lovely cousin Bronya, and a little boy who had been born there after I had left and was now 5, were all taken to Westerbork, and from then to Sobibor, where they were shot immediately they arrived. Sorry. Mundi, my other cousin from there, had gone with his mother's sister to Belgium. And there, one day, they went to visit the sister's husband, who was in hospital with cancer. When they got back to her flat, the police were waiting for them. The headmaster of the school where Mundi had been had betrayed them. He was taken to Auschwitz. He and his aunt were taken to Auschwitz, where obviously they were also murdered.
And the other brothers and sisters? All of them, except?
All the other brothers and sisters, with their husbands and wives and children, were traced to death camps.
42 of them.
42 of them. One brother survived and went to Norway, and my father immediately went to visit him, delighted to find that, someone at least had survived. And he asked him to come back and live with us in London, but he didn't. He had MS, and the health service there were very good, very helpful and supportive. And he was able to work part-time there, so he wanted to stay, but he did come and visit us and was made extremely welcome, as you can imagine. My father, unfortunately, a year later, died of a malignant melanoma, and I'm convinced that he was as much a victim of the Holocaust as any of his siblings. The horror of what he had heard just killed his immune system, and I think he died of that. His brother used to come and visit us often. When he died, I remember I went to Norway. By that time, I was, pretty much grown up. But anyway, in the meantime, much had happened. I'd been to university. I went a week after my father had died. My birthday was the week before he died, and I had a gift from him. He had a melon by the side of his bed, which he carved into a smiling face and sent home with my mother. And that's the most precious gift I ever had.
And Mum, what seeing in the backdrop of what's going on now, what do you think about your, what do you feel? What do you think?
All the places they came from are now part of the Ukraine. Lvov, where my mother came from, as you know, has been badly bombed and had a terrible time. Chernovitz is destroyed. The poor people there, my heart bleeds for them. Don't people ever learn from Holocausts? I'm sorry. It's important to remember these people, and that's why I'm here today, to remember all the ones who died and all the ones whose lives just never existed because they were small children. And it is very important that we continue to remember and hope that those things don't happen again and again. I'm sorry. This is more emotional than I had expected.
God bless you.
God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
It always feels totally inadequate to, or inappropriate to thank. Adam, could you keep Nellie up on the screen? Is she gone? Right, maybe. Really just to thank Nellie for her story, for sharing her story with us. And it's exactly, I think, what you said at the end about the disruption of lives is really what still now, 77 years after all those events, still stays with us. The fact of dislocated lives, of lives cut short, and I'm just amazed that you are able to talk in the way that you have, and we remember all those whose lives meant they weren't even able to share their memories. We see from you those who somehow rebuilt lives, but we are aware of so many who never managed to do so. So for all of that, thank you. I think, Lynette, you said this is the first time you've spoken in public. Is that correct?
Yes.
It is. So a particular thank you for speaking with us as the way you have. We continue with some readings and songs for this time. And I'm going to read the poem Babi Yar by Yevgeny Yevtushenko. Babi Yar was a suburb of Kyiv. It was the largest single massacre in the Shoah. In just 2 days, the 29th and 30th of September 1941, the Nazis took 34,000 Jews to the edge of a ravine just outside Kiev and shot them all. They attempted to destroy the evidence as they were retreating by exhuming bodies and burning them. Later, the Soviet authorities used the place as a municipal rubbish dump. No memorial was ever erected. And in 1961, the poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who was one of the bad boys of Soviet literature at the time, he wrote this poem, Baba Yar. A friend of his, Anatoly Kuznetsov, who was later one of the refuseniks, even though he wasn't Jewish. And in 2011, Yevtushenko spoke to the BBC about it. He said, "I knew there was no monument at Baba Yar, but I was expecting to see some sign of respect. But what I saw was absolutely terrible. There were lots of trucks, and they were unloading garbage on the tens of thousands of people who were killed. I did not expect that. As soon as I got back to my hotel, I sat down and I began to write. It took probably 4 or 5 hours, no more. Most of my poetry is based on either love and tenderness or on shame. It was desperation. Shame came to dictate this poem. I felt guilty myself, a kind of personal sense of guilt on my young, fragile shoulders. I do not call Baba Yar a political poem. It is above politics. Human suffering is more. You cannot compare that with politics." When I read the poem to my wife, she said, "It is so terrible what happened there that it is better not to write about it." And she was right in a way. It's very difficult to find words which are expressive enough. And just listening to Nellie, I mean, all we get is sort of like a tip of an iceberg, but we don't get the emotional, what it must have been like to actually be there. "It was too much for words," he continues. "Words are too weak. I understood her, but I said we have to write about such things. We cannot allow future generations to forget." When I recited Baba Yar for the first time in public, there was an avalanche of silence. I was absolutely shocked, paralyzed. And afterwards, a very, very little old woman with grey hair and a cane, her cane had been knocking against the stage. She came to see me in the dead silence. She said just one sentence: "I was in Baba Yar." She was one of the survivors who crawled from under the mountain of dead bodies. The poem was a criticism of anti-Semitism worldwide, including Soviet anti-Semitism, and was against all kinds of racism. I was not afraid because I had already been expelled from the Literary Institute. I'd been expelled from all kinds of organizations, but I believed there was a future of change for Russia, not long before Stalin had died. That was also important. The poem was one of the changes. It was one first hole in the Iron Curtain. The composer Shostakovich called me, and he was very polite. He said, "You gave words to my thoughts. I have a dream to write music to your poem. Would you be so kind as to give me permission?" I was overwhelmed, on the verge of euphoria. The music of Shostakovich made this poem 10 times stronger. It was his 13th symphony, and it forced Ukrainian party bureaucracy to build a memorial. He was the architect of that memorial. I was in Baba Yar for the first time in 1978. There was a monument there. The inscription spoke about victims of fascism, but there was no sense that this was quite specifically a site, a place of Jewish death. Only in 1991 was that memorial removed and a large menorah erected there, finally acknowledging 50 years, half a century later, what had happened there. So Yevtushenko's poem. I think the other thing is that the poem as it got out to the west and was circulated through samizdat, actually was part of the beginning of the whole Soviet Jewry movement from the beginning of the 1960s. No monument stands over Babi Yar, a drop sheer as a crude gravestone. I am afraid. Today I am as old in years as all the Jewish people. Now I seem to be a Jew. Here I plod through ancient Egypt. Here I perish crucified on the cross. And to this day I bear the scars of nails. I seem to be Dreyfus. The Philistine is both informer and judge. I am behind bars, beset on every side, hounded, spat on, slandered. Squealing dainty ladies in flounced Brussels lace stick their parasols into my face. I seem to be then a young boy in Bialystok. Blood runs, spilling over the floors. The barroom rabble-rousers give off a stench of vodka and onion. A boot kicks me aside, helpless. In vain I plead with these pogrom bullies while they jeer and shout, "Beat the Yids, save Russia." Some grain marketeer beats up my mother. Oh, my Russian people, I know you are international to the core, but those with unclean hands have often made a jingle of your purest name. I know the goodness of my land, how vile these anti-Semites, without a qualm, they pompously called themselves the Union of the Russian People. I seem to be Anne Frank, transparent as a branch in April, and I love and have no need of phrases. My need is that we gaze into each other, how little we can see or smell. We are denied the leaves, we are denied the sky. Yet we can do so much, tenderly embrace each other in a darkened room. They're coming here. Be not afraid. Those are the booming sounds of spring. Spring is coming here. Come then to me. Quick, give me your lips. Are they smashing down the door? No, it's the ice breaking. The wild grasses rustle over Babi Yar. The trees look ominous like judges. Here all things scream silently, and bearing my head, slowly I feel myself turning grey, and I myself am one massive soundless scream above the thousand buried hair. I am each old man here shot dead. I am every child here shot dead. Nothing in me shall ever forget the Internationale, let it thunder, when the last anti-Semite on earth is buried forever. In my blood there is no Jewish blood. In their callous rage, all anti-Semites must hate me now as a Jew. For that reason, I am a true Russian.
We will now hear 2 Yiddish songs, each of which in its own right speaks to the emotion and the experience of this time. The first is called Stiller, Stiller, Hush, Hush. It's a song of the Vilna Ghetto, and the melody was written by an 11-year-old boy named Alex Wolkowicki, who entered this melody in a Vilna Ghetto songwriting contest and won the prize. And a poet named Shmerky Kazerginsky then set these beautiful words to the melody in 1943. Kazerginsky survived the war only to later die in a plane crash. Alex Wolkowicki, as far as I can tell, is still alive and living in Israel and is still involved in music.
Stille, stille, lo mir schweigen, Quorum wachsen do. Soben sie verpflanzt die Sonnen, grünen sie zum Blau.
Esprent was a song written with the words and music by Mordecai Gebirtig. It was following a pogrom that he witnessed, and he witnessed this in 1938. But the words of the song represent how people stood around and watched these awful things happening, and as they continue to do from 1939 onwards through the Holocaust. Ze brennt, briderlich, ze brennt, unser Ohr im Städten Nebech brennt. Beiser Winden mit Jägern, Riesen, Brecken und zerblosen, starken nur die wilde Flammen, als Arumschein brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt das säusig mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt das säusig und zersteht brennt. Brenn, riedelig, brennt. Unser eurem Städten brennt. Beiser Winden mit ihr Gosen Reisen, Brecken und zerblosen, starker noch die wilde Flammen, als Arumschein brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt das säusig mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt das säusig und zersteht brennt.
Our commitment. We remember our 6 million dead who died when violence ruled the world and evil dwelt on earth. We remember those we knew and those whose very name is lost. We mourn for all that died with them, their goodness and their wisdom, which could have saved the world and healed so many wounds. We mourn for the genius and the wit that died, the learning and the laughter that were lost. The world has become a poorer place, and our hearts become cold as we think of the splendor that might have been. We stand in gratitude for their example of decency and goodness. They are like candles which shine out from the darkness of those years, and in their light we know what goodness is and evil. We salute those men and women who were not Jews, who had the courage to stand outside the mob and suffer with us. They too are your witnesses, a source of hope when we despair. May such times never come again. May their suffering serve to prevent the suffering of others. Together we commit to a daily fight against cruelty and prejudice, against tyranny and persecution. May their memory give us strength and lead us on. Together we commit always to remember.
HaShivenu, HaShivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashu
Return us, O God, to our task and to our people. Renew our days as of old. Bring back the time of creation. Return us to our neighbors, to those who have suffered with us, to those who still live in darkness, to those who need our help. Return us and renew us. All of life is return and renewal, is creation after destruction. Akiva walked alongside the Temple Mount and saw the jackals playing among the ruins, and he sensed a divine plan of darkness and light, of a land to be restored, of a people to be returned to God. Our survivors belong to the company of Akiva. We honor and revere them. We are their students. How can we feel what they feel? How can we know what they know? All we can do is to take their silence, and we can take their words and interweave past and present and future, and we can pray and hope. 6 million names come to us out of the destruction. In a world where there was no compassion, we turn to the God of compassion. They are bound up with our lives. May they be bound up in the bundle of eternal life among the holy and the pure who shine so brightly in the firmament of our lives.
We turn to page 657 in our Siddurim as we sing the words from Psalm 103, Enosh Kechatzir. El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer, is on page 8 of our booklets. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamerumim, Hamsei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tahorim, Kizohar Harakia Mazhirim, Lenishmot Shisha Million Achenu Ve'achiotenu, Shemetu al Kiddush Hashem, Yanuchu v'shalva uv'shalom, shelo yadu bechayehem. Ana ba'al harachamim, hastirem beseter kinafecha leolamim. Utzuror bitzror hachayim et nishmatam, Adonai hu nachalatam, ve'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavam, v'nomar Amen. God, full of compassion, whose presence is over us, may the souls of our 6 million dead who have gone to their everlasting home with the holy and pure on high, who shine as the lights of heaven, find the safety and rest denied them on earth beneath the shelter of your presence. Source of mercy, cover them in the shelter of your wings forever and bind their souls into the gathering of life. It is God who is their heritage. May they be at peace in their place of rest. Amen.
Amen. Kaddish is on page V16. And in saying Kaddish, especially on Yom HaShoah, we are the remembrances. We are saying Kaddish for all those who have nobody to say Kaddish for them. And we say together, Yit Gadal v'Yit Gadash Shemei Rabbah, Ba'almad v'vrach Yirotev Yamrit Malchuteh, V'chayechon of Yom Echon, V'chayed Chol Beit Yisrael, Ba'galav V'zman Hariv V'yimru
Amen.
Yehei Shemei Rabbah
Mevarach le'alam u'lanmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitrumam v'yitnaseh.
V'yitata v'yitalei v'yitalal Shemei Dikudusha B'richu. Elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, ti'amiram bi'alma v'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shlama Rabbah min Shemaya, Chayim Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Say shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu,
Aleinu
v'al
ve'al
kol
kol
Yisrael, v'al kol ha'olam, v'yimru Amen.
Please take your seats. As we turn now to page 392 and prepare to conclude this evening's service, we do so with a fire lit underneath each of us, the fire of these candles that we lit at the beginning of the service, a fire that encourages us as we go back out into the world to never forget. And as we heard so powerfully, so poignantly from Nellie this evening, to remember the lessons of the Holocaust, to take them with us into our daily lives to ensure that we play our part in making sure that never again is truly never again. I'd like to take this opportunity before we conclude with the words of Zognik Kainmol to thank Nellie once again for sharing with us so bravely and poignantly her testimony this evening, and to thank all of you for being with us both in the room as well as online to join in this commemoration this evening. There is no better way to end a commemoration, a service such as this, than with the words of Zognik Kainmol, words that have been a march, a rallying cry that has sustained through generations the last few words of this song, of these lyrics, "We survive." We're on page 392. Zognik Kainmol, als du gehst den letzten Weg, und diese Welt neue Fortschritt, neue Weg. Und mein Weg auf unser euch gebenkte Schau, seht erbeugt und uns ertrot mir seinen Tod. Und mein Weg auf unser euch gebenkte Schau, seht erbeugt und uns ertrot mir seinen Tod. Grünen Palmenland, wir feiten weit von Schnee. Wir kommen um mit unserem Bein, mit unserem Weg. Und vorgefahren frischer Schutz von unserem Blut. Sprossen Welt und unser Furor, unser Mut. Und vorgefahren frischer Schutz von unserem Blut. Sprossen Welt und unser Furor, unser Mut. Svett i morgen som bevilder blomsterheit, und den echten Weg verschwinden wir so weit. Nur beisammen mit die Sonne decker jord, vi har parol som griper dit vår blåste dår. Nur beisammen mit die Sonne decker jord, vi har parol som griper dit von Tod zu Tod. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Sie ist nicht kein Lied voll nach Feuer läuft er frei. Das Volk von der Menschen freudig nicht weg. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gales in der Hand. Das Volk von der Menschen freudig nicht weg. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gales in der Hand. So sag nicht einmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Was in den Reihen der verstohlen neue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebenkte Schau. Seid erbeugt und uns ertrot mir seinen Blut. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebenkte Schau. Seid erbeugt und uns ertrot mir seinen Blut. Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.